we've lost both of our children and you don't seem to be depressed. Why are you not depressed? And I struggle with depression. But in losing my husband and honoring him, I'm realizing that he didn't struggle with depression, but he didn't love our children any less. Grief as the final act of love sounds so poetic. And when I hear that, it does resonate with me. It warms my heart. But sometimes grief is pain. In my situation, I would say grief has always been pain. I have a friend who, as she was watching my husband and I at our son's funeral back in 2016, the words grief is praise came to her as she watched my husband raising his hands in kind of worship and praise as we were singing Christian songs from my son's childhood and the songs that we raised our kids to. And I'll tell you, I wrestled with that for many years. Grief is not praise. It doesn't feel like praise. And there's actually a grief is praise song. And I've met that guy that wrote that song. And very moving, touching song. I use it in my controlled grief. But it was written in losing his wife in divorce, not in death. And grief is a part of life. You will experience grief, maybe not the intensity of the grief that I have experienced. But what I would like to do in this video is really break down this poetic thing of grief is the final act of love. And I think two things happen here in expressing love through grief. One, we can learn to cherish the time and love that we had with the person that we lost. But we could also, because we love that person so much, kind of refuse to let go of that grief, let go of the pain of the grief. And if you watch my videos, you know that grief is forever. You can watch a previous video about grief is forever. So I'm not saying we let go of grief, but there are so many people that I know that, come to me to try to, how do you actually process grief? That they're holding on to that pain because they deserve it. Like it is their battle wound. And it's true, it is your battle wound, but battle wounds can heal. They don't have to be gushing wounds. So let's break down this beautiful poetic thing. As I map out my grief, the first thing that always comes to my mind when I say grief is, I always end that with grief is pain. But I've also learned that grief is praise, grief is love. So as I map this out and filming this on my husband and I's first anniversary separated. So my husband died a couple months ago, and this is our first anniversary not physically together. And when you think about grief is love and grief is pain, and I love my husband, I will always love my husband. We spent 26 plus years together. We had 7 children. We had a beautifully painful life. And in his death and in honoring him on our anniversary, that love came to the surface in pride. So if you look at my map as I'm mapping this out, it was very different than losing my children. And if we say grief is love, and then we try to quantify our love through the pain of our grief, we might get stuck. We might be holding on to that pain. Now, unfortunately and fortunately, I've had lots of experience in how to process my grief. And in my husband's case, he was on hospice. We knew he was dying. He was ready to go. As I tell you the story of my son and my daughter, you will see that they were very different. And my husband did not want to end up like my son. And he did not want to be cared for and be kind of that medical trauma and holding on to life. And so in the hospice process, he was not fighting that. He was talking to his counselors, talking to his chaplain, and praying to God. And it was somewhat of a gift to have submitted to the process. And some of that grief and love was able to be processed with him instead of like with my children. It's like I'm doing the grief alone and trying not to quantify grief. I think sometimes when we're holding on to that pain, we're quantifying it. I have lost a child and nobody understands me. And then we start isolating and we think we're showing our love. Like this grief is so painful because I loved so much. Can we integrate those things? Can we love and find joy? So many times, and I've been there, and I've said it to myself, what is the point of finding joy? It's very different. When I lost my daughter, you can see this video of my daughter only a couple weeks before her death. There was no indication that she was going to die. She had so much life, so much joy. She was connected in relationship. She brought me so much joy. Coming home from work and just getting those hugs from her was everything. And when I woke up on December 14th, 2021, to her being dead in her bed, and I went through this whole process of trying to save her life, she was already gone. The pain of that grief is so much more for me because of the trauma that is enmeshed in that grief. With my son Reggie, the trauma was in his life. You can see these pictures of, he was uncomfortable. He was struggling to enjoy life. You can see in the pictures of shortly before my son's death, he was suffering. And the pain of his death was more like a failure to me. And when I think about how I processed his grief and his death and what I had to work through, it was more of I was fighting for his life for 10 years and I lost the fight. All the way back to Johnny's death, which was an accidental drowning at a family reunion. The grief there was different. The grief there was, oh my God, his sisters, the trauma that this is causing our family, the change in which it happened and what happened after that. Like living after that without him in the midst of this big family. And so, yes, I have experienced all types of grief, losing 3 children and my husband. And grief is the final act of love, is beautiful, but I just caution you to, when you are feeling pain, when you are depressed. I know so many people trying to process grief and they are depressed and they think it's, the Kubler-Ross stages of grief and I'm just stuck in this stage of depression. No, it's way more complicated than that. And as I have processed all of these different griefs at different times in my life, when I lost Johnny, I was raising a family. I had, a 4-year-old, a 5-year-old, an 8-year-old, a 9-year-old, and I was entrenched in being a mom. And now I had to help my children grieve their brother, right? That's what moms do. They don't take care of themselves. They take care of their kids. So you see how grief is very individual to your personality, where you are in your life, what that person, what role they played in your life. And yes, how much you love them creates a different, an individual thing that you need to grieve. But although poetic, it's not that simple. And I know that you love deeply the person that you lost. But if we hold on to this, grief is the final act of love, then we're holding on to, oh my God, I have to feel this horrible pain. I'm not allowed to find joy because I love this person so much. I love all my children. And I have been accused of maybe not loving Johnny the same as I love Reggie and Maya. And Johnny was an adopted son. And I love Johnny and I love his sisters, who I still have a relationship with. I am their mother. We are family. But what was happening at that time was I was being a mother. I couldn't break down and be depressed and show how much I loved Johnny in my grief. I had to raise my kids. And his biological sisters were my responsibility. And gosh, the trauma that they experienced prior to me adopting them, like, life is not fair. These hardships are not evenly distributed amongst people. And so those were the things that I was wrestling with. Like, God, why would you do this? Little did I know that I would feel the intensity of that chemical bond in losing my biological children. I have a whole series on the different theories of grief. Throw out the whole Kubler-Ross thing. Like, there is a lot better research out there. And attachment is one of those theories. And attachment can be chemical. When you have a child, you have a chemical bond with that child through a chemical called oxytocin. And then I breastfed both of my children, and oxytocin is released during breastfeeding. So there is a chemical bond. Do I love them any more than my husband, who I chose to be with for 26 years, or my adopted children who I chose to love? It's not quantified. It's different, and that's okay. Oftentimes I see people judging how someone's grieving, and I did it to my husband. You can even see it in the grief documentary. I did it to my husband. I judged. I'm like, we've lost both of our children, and you don't seem to be depressed. Why are you not depressed? And I struggle with depression. But in losing my husband and honoring him, I'm realizing that he didn't struggle with depression, but he didn't love our children any less. So grief is the final act of love, is beautiful, but nothing is that simple. And I want you to process, if that statement resonates with you, I want you to process it personally. What is the other pain that's going on with you? I teach what we call a mentally strong method because I have found that in grief and trauma, it gets enmeshed with everything else in your life. And you probably have some negative self-talk. You probably have some anxiety you need to get control of, probably some spiritual conflict. And some people turn to addiction. All of those things need to be separated out. All of that is not grief. There's a link in the description for grief resources. This is what I do. I help you pull those things apart so that you can actually process grief. And it's a lifetime. Just recently, I had a connection with my late grandfather. He's been gone for many years. And the grief was not intense when I lost him. He lived a big, full life. But I had a moment with him and my relationship with him, and that is part of the grief. So when I say processing, letting go, finding joy, don't resist that. Yes, your intense grief has changed who you are, but you can find joy. You can find purpose. Do not give up. Dig deep and find your mental strength.